This chapter, Jeffrey Preston Bezos, you know you're serious because you used all three names.
I am serious about this, yes. And here's my favorite fact of the pandemic. Not my favorite that I like it. It's just my favorite thing to make sure that people know. And that is that it was during a course of a pandemic where we said to nurses, you have to go into hospitals without sufficient protective gear to try and save lives. At that same time, the financial press started entertaining a question of when America would see its first trillionaire. By one estimate, Pfizer, its partner BioNTech, and Moderna, they were making $1,000 a second, $65,000 a minute, $93 million a day, every single day. Whether you're asleep, whether you're awake, that money's pouring in.
I'm here with John Nichols, the Washington correspondent for The Nation, a contributing writer for The Progressive, and in these times, and the associate editor of Madison, Wisconsin's Capital Times. We are here to discuss his latest book, Coronavirus Criminals and the Pandemic Profiteers. Great read. I had an opportunity to finish it just this morning. I want to ask you, before we get into the topic of this book, you alluded just now to not really knowing what the strength and force of the protest movement in Russia is like right now. But I want to ask you about the protest movement, the anti-war movement, or kind of lack thereof that we're seeing stateside. And we've had guests on recently that have made comparisons, not flattering comparisons, to the level of kind of engagement in the streets that we're seeing now versus in the 80s or even 90s. What do you make of the difference and why we aren't seeing crowds of people filling the streets with an anti-war message? Quite to the contrary, it seems like the shows of solidarity that I've seen, the expressions of support for Ukrainian people, seem to be couched in an explicitly militaristic terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
send more aid, send more weapons, those kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah. As opposed to a real focus on the humanitarian aid, which becomes so absolutely vital. And frankly, a focus on doing everything we can on diplomacy, because ultimately, we want to look for that off-ramp as quick as we can find it. There are people suffering and dying, and something needs to be done. And you're right. This country has wonderful groups that work on anti-war messaging and anti-war activism all the time. Peace Action and Win Without War and the Friends Committee on National Legislation, the Quakers, and you can name the groups. But they are small, and they tend to ramp up and take off at a point when the U.S. is physically preparing to enter into a war, right? When we're going to have, the possibility of our troops, or at least our planes, heading out to some other place. In this case, President Biden has made a very, very big deal from the beginning of saying that U.S. troops won't be on the ground in Ukraine. And that, I think, has had a kind of a dampening impact on anti-war messaging and anti-war activism.
And yet, the war machine is champing at the bit. I'm sure you heard the supercut that The Intercept put out the other day of all of the White House press reporters asking question after question, dozens of questions of Jen Psaki about why Joe Biden doesn't want to implement a no-fly zone.
Why does the U.S. believe they know better what Ukraine needs than what Ukrainian officials are saying they need the most?
It sounds like, we're pretty dug in on our position when it comes to the no-fly zone. To put it bluntly, is Zelensky wasting his time tomorrow asking for these things?
President Zelensky is going to be speaking to Congress tomorrow. He's been pushing for fighter jets, a no-fly zone. You have to hear some of those same requests tomorrow as well. Has the administration shifted on that at all?
Though, calling for a no-fly zone. They're a NATO member. They share a border with Russia. How do we view their calls for a no-fly zone?
Yeah, no, that's exactly the problem. And we are in a situation where, we got a lot of people who don't know very much about the rest of the world, right? When you go into that White House, briefing room there, those people are political reporters, domestic political reporters, by and large, from the U.S. No, nothing against them. That's what they do. They cover presidential campaigns fine. They're great on, if Mitch McConnell gets in an argument with Donald Trump, they can get to the heart of that. But when we're talking about really incredibly intense global issues, which, again, as I've suggested before, we don't know a lot about where it's going because we're in a very, very different place. they tend to often default back to Cold War language. And it's sort of like, oh, the Russians are doing something. Shouldn't we be doing something?
But John, at this point, though, it can't be. I mean, I understand we've all been talking about how nobody knows what a no-fly zone is. And hearteningly, over the past week or so, as there has been more reporting on what a no-fly zone actually entails, which is a direct confrontation with another nuclear power, the public polls in support of a no-fly zone have declined enormously. So now the public at large seems to be educated enough to no longer want a no-fly zone. So that makes me very skeptical that these people in this briefing room are just acting out of ignorance. At this point, there was a day 2 of a chorus of this kind of questioning that also got supercut and put out there in the world. And these people, when you're asking dozens of times in one press conference, the same question that has been asked and answered, it stops feeling like we can chalk this up to ignorance and starts feeling like there is a sincere appetite for a conflict here that is no longer can be laid at the feet of the public who really wants this, because they don't anymore.
No, I don't think the public, look, I think the American people have been pretty clear about this from the start, right? That they don't want boots on the ground in Ukraine. They don't want to get into a global conflict. I mean, this country actually, if you look at the data, has moved to a pretty anti-war position in general. And sometimes you could say it's isolationist. There may be an element of that, but there's also a very strong element of, just looking back at past experience and saying, these things haven't worked out well. And so I take your point that there are people in the briefing room, there are people, who are, reporters, commentators, others who, really are chomping at the bit. But I still would argue that it's rooted in the fact that our media covers wars and global issues as extensions of domestic political concerns, right? It's like, I was fascinated by, there was all these articles a couple of days ago, Biden's poll numbers are up, right, since this occurred. And I thought, well, yeah, okay, that's fine. But, these are the filters through which all of this comes. And so you have this simplistic response of, let's get a no-fly zone, right? A reporter should be embarrassed to ask that question, right? I mean, you should be like, if you thought of yourself as a sophisticated reporter who knew about how things operate in the world, you would think, I'm not going to keep pressing on this issue because I know what that means, and that will make me look like, that's why I go back to that. And it's similar with something which I think is, because I don't think the no-fly zone is going to occur. I think it's similar, though, with something that is, I think, going to occur. And in fact, is, to my mind, occurring very quickly. And that is the ramping up of the military-industrial complex to warp speed. And, I will promise you, unless, wiser heads prevail, we'll look back on this period and we will see kind of weekly, monthly spikes in the amount of money that's going to the Pentagon, right? That it'll expand exponentially. And I'm old enough to remember in the Persian Gulf War back in the early 1990s, and then again in the Iraq War, which was essentially the same war in different iterations, always, by the way, run by a Bush. What you would have happen is they'd have these supplementals, what's referred to as a supplemental, and that's an increase in the Pentagon budget. So the Pentagon budget is, jaw-droppingly huge. It's overwhelming. It's giant, right? And
it's what, half of our... Mm-hmm.
Yeah, depending on how you measure and it's supposed to have all these contingencies in it, right? It's supposed to be prepared for anything that happens, right? And yet we get a problem in Ukraine with Russia, right? And suddenly, we have to expand it a whole bunch. We got to put more money in. We got to keep moving more in. Well, you have to ask yourself, well, what about all those contingencies? And what you realize is that the military-industrial complex is a lobbying machine. And it's constantly at the ready for a moment when they can flip the switch and say, give us more money. And they will find an avenue to do that. And that's what I think you're going to see a lot of. And you'll see Republicans and Democrats saying, we've got to step up and do this. Well, shouldn't they be asking? I mean, even if you're in favor, whatever you're in favor of, shouldn't you be asking, isn't the money already there? I mean, doesn't the Pentagon already have all this money? And the answer is, of course, it is. It does. And what we're really talking about here is, when you talk about 50%, we're talking about moving more of a percentage over to the Pentagon in a situation where, out of a conflict that we hope will end very soon, devastating conflict, but one that we hope will end very soon, and then have in its aftermath a huge humanitarian challenge, right? But instead of focusing on that, getting the resources for that, which really we do need to put resources into, we're going to be moving more and more money over to the Pentagon. Now, last thing I'll say on this is, so we've moved all this money to the Pentagon. We keep moving more and more there. We will have this humanitarian demand. It will require money legitimately, and I'm for that, helping refugees, etc. But then we're going to end up in a situation, I promise you, where they will come to, the American people and say, you know what? We just don't have any money left.
Yeah.
We don't have money for child tax credits. We don't have money for, basic domestic needs. And that if you think back to that distant historic time, which we can barely remember, when there was a Build Back Better bill, and Joe Manchin messes with it and stuff like that. But then they were saying, yeah, but we'll do it piecemeal. We'll do the individual parts of it, right? Always a dumb strategy, but that's what they were going to do. How much are you hearing that now?
Well, the pathology of this situation is it isn't even just, I'm going to tell you after the fact of the war, after we spent the money on military spending, that we don't have any money left. They were telling us they didn't have money left before this crisis popped off, and then came up with the money for the crisis.
Of course, you're right. They're always looking for an excuse to say there's no money to feed a hungry child or to give health care to somebody that needs it. I mean, that's a constant. And, obviously we'll talk a little bit about my book. And, one of the things that's striking in writing about the pandemic was that there was a brief moment in March of 2020 when everybody got scared. I'm not just talking about you and I, who, we sit here and go into our dystopian discussion and end up figuring out all the things we should be afraid of. I'm saying just across the board, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, Washington was scared, right? Well, what did they do? In a week or so, they found $2 trillion.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's just like, oh, we need a couple $trillion bucks. Yep, we got it. And then they turn around in very short order and say, it turns out $2 trillion wasn't enough. We need a couple more trillion that we're going to move over to this. And House moves it very, very quickly. The only reason it didn't immediately get spent by the summer of 2020 was because Mitch McConnell held it up because he wanted to make sure they could protect corporations from lawsuits. I mean, that was right. It wasn't that Mitch McConnell said this is too expensive. It was just he wanted to ladle on his corporate protections. But the end result was, in a very short amount of time, we found, trillions and trillions of dollars that we said we didn't have. And you know what we used those trillions of dollars for? I mean, there's a lot of corruption. There's always problems. But the baseline theory of it was, we're going to help poor people. We're going to give them free medicine. We're going to give them checks and stuff like that. And so, lo and behold, what we discovered was we could have always done that.
Right. And there was a lot of crowing about those efforts, much of it deserved, having child poverty and the like. Much quieter reporting on doubling child poverty when these things were allowed to expire. Much less crowing about the enormous upward transfer of wealth that spending also entailed. And that's why maybe this is a good moment to turn back to the book, because I think one of the most compelling chapters was the chapter on Pfizer's profiteering and also the chapter on Jeff Bezos, which in combination point to the extent to which profiteers are going to profiteer and exploit these kinds of situations, and which I think dovetails interestingly with other sections of the book that engage with COVID skepticism, some of which is political, some of which is driven by some frustrations with the pharmaceutical industry and its long history, including with the AIDS crisis, which you also talk about in the book, has caused a great deal of distrust among the American people. So how about we start by giving people who have perhaps forgotten or suppressed in the interest of their own mental health exactly what went down, the ways in which Pfizer exploited this crisis, what the biggest takeaways from that were for you.
Oh, well, it's hard to know where to begin, but it's important to point out that pharmaceutical companies don't like to do vaccines. That's a beginning point. Well, because if a vaccine works, you need a shot. Maybe you need a booster. I've got my 2 shots of my booster, and I'll get another one as soon as I can. But at the end of the day, that's a handful of shots, right? Pharmaceutical companies like something you have to take every day for the rest of your life.
They love a chronic illness.
Yes. I mean,
or erectile dysfunction.
Let's not be,
Depression.
or baldness is good.
Yeah.
Look, but the bottom line is, so you figured it out, right? There you go. That's it. Vaccines are not things that they love to do. And, the powerful interests in the world know that. And so right off the bat, the pharmaceutical companies were basically saying, yeah, we want to help save the world and everything like that, but we're going to need a lot of incentives. We're going to need a lot of help up front. And so what did they get? They got research that was done in the public sector. The sharing of DNA at the start of the crisis was incredibly important. And this was done by scientists all over the world who are cooperating in an urgent level, not to make money, but to figure out how to deal with this issue. And so there was this incredible consortium of governments and scientists and universities all pouring their ideas in, all pouring their research in. The pharmaceutical companies didn't have to do that. It was done for them, right? And so they've got all this stuff put together. And then they do, in fact, develop the vaccines. And Pfizer was first out of the gate. Very shortly before the others. But it was this fascinating thing because Pfizer had cut a deal where they said, look, we're not going to take restrictions on, what we can make off this because we're going to really race to get you something. Okay, that sounded okay. What they got you was something that had to be, if you'll recall, frozen to like 85 degrees below zero. Well, what did that mean? That meant that that's not going to the developing world. That's not going to, the global south. That's going to elite countries that have a lot of refrigeration. And then they went out and they cut their deals for it. They cut those deals and they were huge. They got incredible amounts of money. They got commitments to re-up the deals. And so what do we end up with a situation? Well, what we know is about 1.5 years into the pandemic, last fall, let's say, and that's at a point where the vaccines have been out for roughly 8-10 months, in mass circulation. By one estimate, Pfizer, its partner BioNTech, and Moderna, they were making $1,000 a second, $65,000 a minute, $93 million a day, every single day. Whether you're asleep, whether you're awake, that money's pouring in. We just had the profit statements come out from Pfizer, Moderna, these other companies. Pfizer had, just exponential profits. Right? They're $20 billion in profits off the vaccine. And they're predicting more for next year because they not only have the vaccine, they also now have, some drug that they've developed, et cetera. And this is just massive amounts of money. Now, Moderna and the others don't make quite as much, but because Pfizer actually did, set things up really well for itself. And the weird part about it, you read the chapter, the Pfizer executive brags about this. The head of Pfizer isn't concerned about what you and I are saying about it. The head of Pfizer is concerned about what Wall Street thinks about it. And what he's saying again and again and again is, these are golden times. This is, we've hit the gravy train. This is incredible. Invest money with us because we're going to be making money like you wouldn't believe. And all I would do is just pause and say, in this regard, during World War II, which was a different circumstance. I'm not comparing wars to pandemics or to economic meltdowns or to depressions. These are all different things. But during World War II, we were told we were all in it together. This was a time of immense sacrifice. This is a really challenging moment. And what did they say to the defense industries during World War II? They all got hit with an excess profits tax. And that excess profits tax said that anything you made above what you were making before the war, so maybe you made, $1 million a year before the war, if you're up to $3 million during the war because you're doing this round-the-clock production and stuff like that, they taxed you back down to what you made before. If we said that to Pfizer, we'd be, taking tens of billions of dollars back into the public sector.
So, I want to put a fine point on that. So you're telling me that in the last 2 years and all the conversations that have been had about profiteering in various respects, there's not a Democrat, progressive, independent from Vermont who's raised the issue of an excess profit tax?
There's a little bit of talk about it, in fairness. Bernie Sanders has been quite good on taxing billionaires, right? And then just of late with the oil companies, and by the way, their profiteering actually relates to the pandemic as well as to the situation with Russia. There has been a proposal by Sheldon Whitehouse and Ro Khanna and some others to do a windfall profits tax on the oil companies per se. But
not with respect to these pharmaceutical companies.
That's exactly it. And that's what I keep arguing, is that if we have a rational approach to this, if we're just realistic about it, what we should say is these pharmaceutical companies aren't going to go away, right? They're not going to fold up. They aren't going to, say, oh, we're not going to make vaccines anymore. If you put an excess profits tax on them, right, they're still going to end up having more money. They have all the money they had before, right? Up to the time of the pandemic. It's not going to tax them out of existence. It is basic fairness. But we don't, as a country, talk in that way.
Right.
And that's why I wrote the book.
And I want to put even a finer point in this because I want to hop over to this chapter, Jeffrey Preston Bezos. You're serious because you used all three names.
I am serious about this, yes. Also, if your middle name is Preston, right off the bat,
I tend to agree. It's a silver spoon name if there ever was one. It's right up there with a Robinette. But here, I want to read this a little bit because this was, these things, but it's really galling to read. You write of billionaires in general, their pandemic profits are so immense that America's billionaires could pay for a major COVID relief bill and still not lose a dime of their pre-virus riches, said Frank Clemente, the executive director of American for Tax Fairness. Indeed, according to the Watchdog Group's analysis, the $1 trillion wealth gained by those 651 billionaires in the first 9 months of the pandemic shutdown was more than it would cost to send a stimulus check of $3,000 to one of the roughly 330 million people in America. A family of four would receive over $12,000. It's double the 2-year estimated budget gap of all state and local governments, which is forecast to be at least $500 billion. Only slightly less than total federal spending on Medicare and Medicaid in fiscal year 2019, which together serve 120 million Americans, and nearly 4 times the $267 billion total in stimulus payments made to 159 million people last year.
Yep. And you know what? Little kind of revelation here. Books are written and then time passes before they come out, right? So that's my report from a few months ago as we were finishing the book. I was literally updating it. It's a funny thing about writing a book about pandemic profiteering. As late as you can update it, you can add massive new figures because the profiteering occurs at such a rapid rate. But since then, what we now know, and again, this is going to keep expanding, it's going to keep growing. But according to Americans for Tax Fairness and the Institute for Policy Studies and other groups, they've been tracking this. Chuck Collins, who is great, has been tracking a lot of this billionaire wealth. What we know is that in the roughly first 18, 19 months of the pandemic, and it'll keep growing, but billionaires came into that with $3 trillion in wealth. That's what they had, laying around. It's not bad. There were 650 billionaires who had $3 trillion in wealth. Year and a half into the pandemic, a little over that, they had $5 trillion. They made $2 trillion. That's one of the most exponential increases in wealth for the super rich, a redistribution of the wealth upwards. And then here's the interesting thing. There were no longer 650. It went up to 714. We were the one thing we grew during the pandemic was billionaires. There were more and more billionaires. And here's my favorite fact of the pandemic. Not my favorite that I like it. It's just my favorite thing to make sure that people know. And that is that it was during a course of a pandemic where we said to nurses, you have to go into hospitals without sufficient protective gear to try and save lives. Where we said to bus drivers, You have to drive the streets of American cities, pick up people, try and get them to hospitals, try and get them to their care, even though you don't have adequate care. When we said to immigrants working in meatpacking plants, you have to go into those plants and work every day around the clock, even though you don't have adequate care. When we said you have to do that in a spirit of shared sacrifice. At that same time, the financial press started entertaining a question of when America would see its first trillionaire. Far from, everybody else is sharing in sacrifice. And billionaires are making so much money. Their expansion of wealth is so rapid that literally there is a discussion of whether Bezos or Elon Musk will be the first trillionaire. That's what happened during the pandemic. And if you pull the brake and pause and just think about that, I think you have to say to yourself, this is evidence of something that is so dark, so evil in the way that we arrange our economics, that it ought to make us pause as a country and ask whether we should have billionaires at all.
John, who does this make you mad at? Because we're sitting here and it's 2022 and it's a midterm election year. And as you mentioned, Joe Biden's poll numbers have benefited somewhat from this conflict in Ukraine. There is a real push to characterize the pandemic as over, although there is some suggestion that there's some variants, some hot new variants coming our way. I assume that much of your book was written kind of before Omicron changed a lot of what we thought we knew about, the efficacy of vaccines in terms of transmission between people. Different kinds of mask rules were ratcheted up when there was an acknowledgement finally that the cloth masks weren't as effective as the surgical masks, which seemed extremely obvious to me from the get-go. But and now there's another pivot where we're having Democratic administration, a very kind of performatively maskless State of the Union. And in the book, which I think leverages rightly a lot of critique of the way that the Trump administration played fast and loose with those kind of guidelines and very affirmatively politicized this stuff. Does, apart from the chapters about Cuomo and the nursing home scandal and Rahm Emanuel's role, for many of chapters kind of focuses on the Republicans and ignores the extent to which there was some equivocation, right? Coming from Fauci back and forth about the merits of masking and things like that. And so I wonder today, as you look with the context of a year of the Biden administration behind us, and seeing the ways that the Biden administration seems to be politicizing COVID in different ways, you can argue much less dangerous ways. I'm not trying to make comparisons to absolve anybody. But who are you mad at now? Mm-hmm. Who should people be mad at and what to do about it?
Sure. No problems remaining mad at the Trump folks. And I just want to emphasize that because I'm going to go beyond this. No problem at all being mad at the Trump folks. The Lancet study showed that if they had just followed the basic standards that other countries did, 40% of the deaths in the first year wouldn't have occurred. So think about that. That's hundreds of thousands of people died because they simply didn't make the basic effort. And that holds to many cabinet members and et cetera. But to your question, I have a piece coming out in The Nation it'll be a week or so on exactly what you're talking about. Democratic governors around the country are, they got freaked out by the Virginia result where Glenn Youngkin won for governor. He beat Terry McAuliffe, one of their favorite Democratic, retreads. And McAuliffe ran a lousy campaign, blah, blah, blah. But what the Democratic consultant class took away from that is, people are sick of COVID, right? They're ready to move on, and they don't like critical race theory either, blah, blah, blah. They had all this very bad analysis of what really happened. And the end result is that now we see Democratic governors saying, yep, it's pretty much over. We're going to, the states are going to operate differently. We're just going to, kind of put this behind us. We're not going to do the mask mandates. We're not going to check if you're vaccinated at restaurants. We're just going to move on forward. I'm sorry. We have, on the days where they've been making some of these announcements, we had more people dying than we had a year before. That same day of the year, there were more dying now than there were a year before.
Right.
This pandemic isn't over. It comes in waves. And in the book, I justifiably and appropriately condemn Mike Pence as an example, for, lying and saying when a wave was coming that it wasn't a new wave of the pandemic. Totally justified. Well, now I think we have to say to Democrats the same thing. Don't lie to us. Don't give us this fantasy that we're beyond it. And the weird part about it is polling says the American people are cool with the truth. The data shows that the American people are quite willing to wear a mask if you're told that that's what they should do. They're willing to, accept the demands. They don't like it. But what I think a lot of the Democrats don't understand is there's a difference between something that people don't like and something that will make them, vote differently. If Democrats were leveling with people about the fact that this is an ongoing pandemic, that there is a very good chance there'll be another wave, that we have to do a whole lot right now to make sure that we're ahead of the curve, and that some of the things we have to do include cracking down on the pharmaceutical companies, include taxing the billionaires, doing all those things, and then moving that money over to what we lacked. Remember, the pandemic showed our vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Don't have a national health care plan. Don't have a social welfare state. Don't have the basic infrastructure as regards manufacturing to be able to produce what we need. We know exactly what we should be doing. And so if I would tell you, you say, who am I mad at? I'm mad at the Democrats who came to power in 2021, start of 2021, with not as big a mandate as they needed, but they had it, right? And they were coming, remember, that was in the midst of a pandemic surge. What they should have done at that point is frame out a purely pandemic-related response. Not, what they did was fine. The American Relief Act was actually quite good. It bailed out a lot of hospitals and cities and schools and stuff like that. But what they should have done is say, look, we're not going to lie to you. This thing it's going to be with us for quite a while until we figure out a lot of stuff. And so we need to move a lot of resources to health, social services, all the basics, and we need to get that money. And we need to go after the people that have the money.
American Relief Act was helpful, but what I recall the conversation being around that time was the Democrats bargaining against themselves down, talking about, the 2,000 checks became this a trigonometry equation where nobody could agree about what numbers added up, and somehow 1,400 was 2,000. There was at one point some disagreement within the Democratic Party. I remember Ro Khanna pushing back against some of Nancy Pelosi's framing, but the consensus emerged around the need to win Georgia and all of that. Georgia was won on the backs of promises around $2,000 checks, which never materialized, and which many, many people have not forgotten. I cannot express the extent to which, I'm sorry, I know that the internet isn't real life, but I'm not exactly a pollster running out here knocking doors and getting information. So what I know is that when I go to the comment section of any political post, you've heard me say this a million times, my audience has, whether it's the shade room, whether it's some random TikTok, whether it's whatever it is, there are still people in there talking about the stimulus checks that they didn't get and the fact that they still have student loan debt that isn't canceled.
No, these are, look, and I know a funny thing? I know this is going to shock you, but Republicans are kind of cynical. You know what? And you want to know if we have another COVID surge this summer, this fall, right? Do you know what Republicans are going to be saying? It's the Biden surge, right? It's
right.
This is, and they will pivot and blame the Democrats for failing to provide the care that Democrats didn't provide. And this is where it becomes really a devastating thing politically. The Democrats don't understand one of the basics of politics, and that is that accountability drives policy. And so when they came in January of 2021, what they should have said is, we are immediately going to investigate the failures of the Trump administration. We're going to investigate profiteering by pharmaceutical companies and other companies. We're going to investigate the profiteering by billionaires. We're going to do taxes. We're going to do all this stuff. They should have said that right away, because those investigations, that accountability demand, then makes it easier to drive policy, right?
But what did we get? We got 1/6 accountability. And now we have Tucker Carlson being the only person on mainstream television who was talking about some of these pharmaceutical concerns and completely conceding that kind of argument to the right. Meanwhile, to your earlier point, it was Joe Biden who said, quote, anyone who's responsible for that many deaths should not remain as president of the United States of America. There have now been more people who've died under the Biden administration, even with vaccines, than Donald Trump. And the reality is that when we hit 100,000 deaths, it was a front page story in the New York Times with a very dramatic spike graph. And that was, sincerely and rightfully announced what a tragedy that was. Approaching 1 million deaths, the 1 million death marker, not a word.
Yeah. And you see, this is the thing. And again, I write a lot in the book, as you know, about FDR and the Depression era. And this is an important thing to understand. FDR became president in 1933. The Depression had started in 1929. It didn't end under FDR. It didn't end until, at least World War II kind of shifted us there. But because FDR focused on accountability, because he talked about Hoover all the time, and because they did investigate the bankers and the financial players, they did the Pecora Commission, they drove changes. The end result was FDR didn't get blamed for the fact that he couldn't end the Depression. People said, well, look, we know it's still going. We know we're still suffering, but this guy's trying, right? And it's clear, we understand where responsibility lies. We understand, where the efforts are being made. Maybe he wasn't perfect, but you get the dynamic. Biden's not doing that. And so the end result is Biden's intentions, I would say, are better. I'll give him his due, right? But what is it,
better than Trump. I mean, the bar's on the floor.
I know. Come on. Exactly. And where does that get you politically? Where does that get you to say your intentions are good when, you're not dealing with it? And so I think this is the missing element that Democrats completely don't understand. And they haven't for years. It's just stunning. I'm going to do my litany here. Richard Nixon, completely corrupts the political process. They let him get on a plane and fly to San Clemente and start rebuilding his reputation. He was never impeached. He was never held to account. Ronald Reagan does Iran-Contra, right? They do an investigation. They find, it was horrible, blah, blah, blah. They don't do anything about it. Reagan flies off, no accountability. Clinton destroys the Roosevelt era protections for social welfare and for Wall Street and banking. And, he flies off, everything's fine there. Bush and Cheney lead us into an illegal and immoral war. And then they crash the global economy. Democrats come in charge and say, oh, that's behind us. Let's keep going on. I mean, Democrats, by and large, when they come to power, instead of saying, we just went through hell and we're gonna make sure that those who took us through hell are held to account, they say, no, we're moving on to the next thing. And I hate to say it, I think the reason they do it is because they don't want to push an accountability agenda that will ultimately end up, forcing them to operate within certain lines, right?
I'm glad you said it. I'm glad you said it because I wanted to come back to this part of the book. I got to say, reading this book, it was a time warp in the best and worst of ways because it feels like it's not that distant history, but the way we talk about things has changed so radically from 2020 to 2021 and from 2021 to 2022 that even reading about the events of early 2021 feels like, full on Rocky Horror time warp zone.
Yeah.
Right. So you talk about the vice presidential debate, and there's this moment where Kamala pushes back against Pence's efforts to downplay the coronavirus. And she says they minimize the seriousness of it. The president said, if you're on one side of his ledger, if you wear a mask, you're on the other side of his ledger if you don't. And in spite of all of that, today, they still don't have a plan. Well, Joe Biden does. And our plan is about what we need to do around a national strategy for contact tracing, for testing, for administration of the vaccine and making sure it'll be free for all. That is the plan that Joe Biden and I have, knowing that we have to get a hold of what's been going on. We need to save our country. Contact tracing? How did that go? Because I remember reading just a few days ago in the New York Times that the CDC has basically nixed nixed its recommendation for contact tracing.
Yeah. Look, I mean, so much of what we talked about as proper responses, it's gotten mushy, it's gotten vague. And we were just talking about that a moment ago. We've got these Democratic governors saying, maybe we don't need to do the mask mandate. Maybe we don't need to, check vaccine cards and stuff like that. Do you know the interesting thing is? The mask mandates and the checking vaccine cards, that worked. It was highly successful. It protected a lot of people.
Tell me more about that, because I will say I have, as a kind of libertarian socialist, I'm generally hesitant. I'm mandate hesitant.
I understand.
As someone who is double vaccine boosted as well, I would have liked us to have had a more robust conversation about how to quiet people's, I think, oftentimes legitimate concerns about vaccines and pharma and all of the things we've discussed before we got to a place where we were talking about mandates. And there's different kinds of things, right? People are talking about a lot of different stuff when they're talking about mandates. If a store says wear a mask when you come in the store, that's a different thing from these kind of
absolutely
more centrally mandated mandates.
Yeah.
But talk to me about the effect that some of these policies had on the spread of the virus.
Look, I mean, a couple of things that we should basically understand. I do believe the science that says that getting a vaccine, getting the booster, was very, very helpful to people who got COVID during Omicron, right? That people got it, but they didn't get as serious a case. So I think that there's a pretty good argument there. I think that there's very little doubt in my mind. I looked at the science. I think that mask mandates helped. I think that they had a really good impact on slowing the spread of the disease in a lot of settings, and so I think that's to the benefit. Yeah.
But what do you say about this argument that people have, though? I mean, the argument that people have, because I can hear it, I can hear them preemptively in my ears, is that in the world of Omicron and these variants, where the vaccine is not preventing you from getting it, although it is very meaningfully preventing you from having the worst effects and death.
Getting really sick. Yeah.
Correct. Then the mask becomes about your own, and also it doesn't impede your ability to transmit because you're still getting it and basically having as much in terms of viral load than the person who isn't vaccinated. There are some differences, but arguably not statistically meaningful. Then the mask wearing for your own self-protection is legitimate and valid. And I wear a mask, although it's not required in my building anymore and stuff like that. But the mandate to say the hook for the mandates was you have to wear a mask to protect your fellow man. If that is no longer dispositive and your ability to transmit to your fellow man, then the mandate loses its punch.
It loses some of its punch. I'm in Iceland right now. And on February 25th, I believe, they dropped it all. And if you walk down the street, nobody's wearing a mask. And they did have a spike in cases, right? There's a decent number of cases, but they don't seem to be very serious. You know what I mean? It's and they're functioning as a country. And so there's a lot that we don't know about, and I'm very open about acknowledging this, about how best to deal with this next stage that we were in. Remember, we sort of cobbled this thing together as we went along the way, right? And I think that much of what we tried to do along the way was to the good. It was well intended. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. I think some of the mandates were successful and were useful at critical times. Many of them were very unpopular, or people got frustrated with them. Polling says people weren't as frustrated or they weren't as unpopular as I think a lot of Democrats now think they were. But there was all that. Here's the bottom line. We spend so much time talking about mandates. We spend so much time talking about masks and vaccines. What we don't spend time talking about is why the pandemic was so bad in the United States. And this is an important thing to understand. The pandemic was really, really bad in the United States because we don't have a national healthcare system, because we don't have a social welfare state, because we don't have industrial planning that would have said, don't ship all of your protective gear manufacturing offshore so that you've then got to have Jared Kushner re-import it to the United States. And so what we really need to do now is recognize that there are cynical players on all sides who are going to play the politics of different elements of it. But there are core truths here. And one of the things that I hope comes out of the book is the core truth that, and it's why I wrote the chapter on the Rahm Emanuel. We we had trade policies for a quarter century that left us vulnerable when this pandemic hit. It's one of the reasons that I focus a lot and talk a lot about single-payer Medicare for all healthcare in the book. Because if we'd had a national health system with public health, would we have made mistakes? Absolutely. Would we have erred? Absolutely. But we would have had I would imagine, a trusted, respected, universal, ubiquitous system to communicate and to debate about how it should work. I mean, it would have been so much different and so much better. But we didn't have any of that. And now, because there is very little accountability for all the deaths that occurred, very little accountability for, the errors that were made and that continue to be made, we face the very real prospect that we're not going to do any of that. We're not going to get the national health care plan. We're not going to establish a social welfare state. We're not going to do the industrial policy. And as a country, we're going to end up exactly where we were. And the next pandemic, everybody I talked to and working on this book, everybody said, the next one's going to be worse. It's going to hit harder.
So, John, answer me this. And this is the controversial question, but I have to ask it because it's what a lot of people listening to this are going to be thinking. Why should anybody stand in line and vote for a Democrat this fall or in 2024? Why should we invest in progressive candidates if having an unprecedented number in Congress, I'm not saying should have gotten us Medicare for all, but should at least be making this from their pulpit a part of the national conversation in a way that is absolutely not right now. Yeah. Again, Tucker Carlson is single-handedly almost advancing criticism of the pharmaceutical industry in this moment.
Yeah, look, I'm not here to tell you to vote for any party. What I will tell you is this. On balance, I think that the Democrats are a little bit more for democracy than the Republicans. I'll give them that.
A little bit more. I'm a little bit more for democracy. Again, the bar isn't just on the ground; it's a painted stripe on the street.
I'm not. Yes, allow me to finish my thought. Okay. And so it's so I'm not gonna beat them up on that per se. What I'm gonna say is this: we're looking at a moment of staggeringly missed opportunity, and there ought to be a sense of rage about what we've been through and what we continue to go through, and a failure of action in that regard. And the crisis of the Democratic Party, and it's a real crisis, is that they have dialed that rage down. They have squandered the accountability moment. We are more than a year in to Democrats being in control of the White House, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. And you can talk all you want about Joe Manchin and about Kyrsten Sinema and whatever else you want to talk about. The fact of the matter is they have that control. There is so much that can be done with accountability, and it just hasn't been done. There's a little in the House. They have a little committee that deals with, like people who, got a bigger check from one of the stimulus programs than they should have and stuff like that, right? But they're not going to the heart of the matter. And I will tell you, people ask the question of should you be excited about the Democrats? It's not me telling you should or shouldn't. It's going to be the people. That's where for the Democratic Party, they ought to read my book, and they ought to recognize that they've made a terrible error. They've wasted a year. And this waste of a year without accountability, and remember, accountability drives policy. It makes it easier to pass big things when you have people upset and angry and enraged about how so many deaths occurred that didn't have to occur. They failed. They failed in this regard. And it astounds me. It astounds me that now we're in a situation where, half the discussion is about if COVID isn't over, it's pretty close to over, and you can move on to the next thing. Nothing in reading the science. And I spent a year. That's what I did. I read the reports. I talked to the scientists. I talked to the folks. Just nothing that says this thing is necessarily over. It's a fool's mission. And so what I would tell you is, People can vote for who they want to vote for. That's fine. But what they should recognize is if by some chance they want the Democrats to beat the Republicans, they should be furious at the Democrats because the Democrats have done such a lousy job of taking what should have been a baseline responsibility. And that is saying, why did we have a dramatically higher death rate than other countries? Why did our corporations profit at an exponentially higher rate? Why did our billionaires become dramatically richer? Right? Why did these things happen? Now, the problem with that, and you know it as well as I, that if we ask those questions, right, and if we really get serious about it, that means that it isn't just the Republican Party that's in trouble. The Democratic Party would have to change as well. The Democratic Party would have to recognize that it can't operate the way that it does. And I fear that there are too many Democrats who are like, maybe we don't have to really spend too much time exploring accountability. But I would tell you this, and I'd say it with deep passion. Without accountability, we're going to end up with the same people in charge again, the same irresponsible, uncaring responses. And it will be worse. It will be dramatically worse, and it won't be long. I mean, we are in an era of pandemics. This is not, sometimes a pandemic hits, sometimes it doesn't. But the fact of the matter is that this should be the moment in which we get our act together. And if we don't, and my fear is that we may not, if we don't, we will be haunted by this for the rest of our lives. That's how serious it is.
That I think that is the fundamental point where you referenced earlier this idea that, people believe that Democrats are acting in good faith or have good intentions, or at least better intentions than Republicans. But at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves why it is that all these good intentions don't manifest in policy changes if we're so able to identify what the flaws are on the right side of the aisle. And that's why I think it's so important that you did include these chapters on Democrats, Cuomo and Rahm Emanuel, because it's not just bad actors, one-offs. It is systemic. You quote friend of the show, David Sirota, as reporting that 3 of the hospital association's top officials separately gave more than $150,000 to Cuomo's campaign between 2015 and 2018. And all during his second term, Cuomo's campaign and his state party committee raked in more than $2.3 million from hospital and nursing home industry donors and their lobbying firms, according to data compiled by the National Institute of Money and Politics. And of course, people who are listening to this are probably well aware of how many people died because of the nursing home scandal, which didn't ultimately take down Cuomo. It was his sexual harassment scandal that ultimately did the job, cutting off, in some ironic way, his chance at accountability for that, for the nursing home scandal. Although, of course, he should be accountable for the sexual misconduct as well.
No, look, here's the bottom line. And what I did, you'll notice the Cuomo chapter is very long because there's a lot to deal with there. And it's so horrifying because there were honest mistakes and there were deliberate actions. And the combination was that you ended up with an incredible level of death. And where there were honest mistakes and deliberate bad actions, all of it, the Cuomo administration tried to cover up. They lied about it. They tried to punish individuals like Ron Kim and others who raised concerns. And so we end up in this situation where I believe in impeachment. I love impeachment. I always have. And I think there's no question that Trump should have been impeached for his handling of COVID. He lied to the American people. He literally said to Bob Woodward, I'm playing this thing down because I don't want people to get scared and stuff like that. For political purposes, he and his administration took actions that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans that were unnecessary. So should he be impeached for that? Absolutely. That's a baseline standard. That's using impeachment in the way that it should. But so too should Cuomo have been. And this is the important thing. They let Cuomo, resign in New York. I wouldn't have. I would have said, yeah, you can resign if you want, but we're going to see this thing through. And I think you see the sexual harassment through, but you also see the nursing home thing through. He should have been impeached for that. He should have been, they should have seen that through to the end. You should have had the hearings. You should have had the conviction because, again, that's baseline accountability. You several times said, it's like lowering the bar to the floor, right? Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've lowered the bar to the floor, and then we've opened up the floor and taken it down below.
It's a ditch.
Floor.
The bar is a ditch.
Now we're going to Middle Earth here. I mean, this is journey to the center of the earth stuff. We're going so far below the baseline because the fact of the matter is, if you have the ability to hold somebody to account, and you say, well, we're going to hold them to account because, they said this, we didn't like it, or they took money from this guy, we didn't like it. I'm sorry, I agree with that. I love, all that. But why not say, yeah, if you take actions that lead to the deaths of tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, you can be impeached for that. You can be held to account for that. Do you understand what that would mean politically? If we just did it once, if we held people to account for deaths that were unnecessary on their watch, wouldn't that make future governors of New York and future presidents a little more wary about, putting politics ahead of human life? I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I'd like to try it. I would like to try accountability at a deep and fundamental level. And I think, just to close the accountability circle, I think there are multiple forms of accountability. There's criminal charges, and we talk about that all the time, right? We get very obsessed with that. There's civil action, where you sue people, and that's complicated, and the rich people always have all the best lawyers and stuff like that. There's political action, right? There's impeachments and censures and things of that nature. But there's also, one final form of accountability that I don't think we as a society understand it as such, but we should. Taxation is accountability, right? It's saying, you're getting a great benefit out of this society. If you're sort of taking advantage of it, we're going to take that money back. And so imagine the signal that would be sent if we did a windfall profits tax on the pharmaceutical companies, and we did a, straight on claw it back tax on the billionaires. Roosevelt, during World War II, the tax on corporations, the excess profits tax, could be as high as 90%. The tax on individuals who made excess, whose wealth, expanded during the war, could go as high as 95%. That's Franklin Roosevelt. And you know what the interesting thing was? When Roosevelt left, we went through Truman, who I'm not very impressed with for a variety of reasons, but he kept a lot of this. Then we got into Eisenhower, a Republican. We were still over 90% tax, a top individual tax on the wealthy, on rich people. Democrats, Republicans accepted this basic concept. Now we don't. We don't even have it. It's barely discussed. And so we don't have accountability from a criminal standpoint. Where are the people being charged for bad actions? We have very little accountability from a civil standpoint. Both Cuomo and Mitch McConnell fought for liability shields for corporations during the course of the pandemic, literally held up action on things until they got liability shields for corporations. We don't have political accountability because we don't impeach for, letting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people die. And we don't have tax accountability because the fact of the matter is that Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are talking about taking Pete Davidson to outer space because they have so much money, they don't even know what to do with it all.
I haven't heard about the Pete Davidson Pilot Pete angle.
Come on. It's like you have so much money, you're taking TV stars to outer space. I mean,
he's having a year, isn't he? God bless Pete Davidson.
To the credit of Pete Davidson, I think to Pete Davidson, I think he's backed out of the thing because he has a level of embarrassment that Musk and Bezos do not have. But the bottom line is that criminal, civil, political, tax accountability seems to be off the table in the United States, whether Republicans or Democrats are in charge. And as long as that remains the case, then we are on a steady spiral that is it's on repeat. And I wrote a book because I want to break that cycle.
Well, the accountability tome in question is Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers. Thank you so much, John Nichols, for keeping the conversation about accountability going, despite a lot of silence from some progressive heroes and people who we never had that much faith in to begin with. I do think it's going to take much more of an outside push to keep any of the things that were so front of mind in the 2016 and 2020 cycles. friend of mine, as we head into not the end of the pandemic, but a new, to your point, kind of recurring pandemic world where we need these things more than ever. John, can you tell people where to find your book and anything else you're working on, social media accounts,
Sure.
all of that?
That's very kind of you. Find the book at an independent bookstore. They went through a lot of hell during this process. The independent bookstores are the place, that put Chomsky up front by the cash register. And so the bottom line is that's where I encourage people to go. You can. I'm lucky. You can find it online in all sorts of places and that. But I'm really pushing the independent bookstores and also the independent online operations that try to do this. What I'm working on, I have a big piece coming up on the politics of COVID, what we discussed a little bit. That'll come out in The Nation in a week or so. And it's pretty rough on a lot of the current players because at the end of the day, they're not rising to the occasion. I'm also working a lot on a lot of things longer term, but particularly on, I happen to be talking to you from Reykjavik in Iceland. And I'm working on the issue that kind of got pushed aside during the pandemic, which is climate change. And it didn't slow down. And the reality is that the climate crisis is getting more serious by the day. The Arctic is melting. And as it melts, we're going to see a situation where commercial interests are going to move into the Arctic at a much higher level because they're going to find shipping lanes that will allow them to move products on routes that didn't previously exist. That's much quicker. It's much cheaper. Wealthy individuals and companies are going to make a lot more money because of the melting of the Arctic. And unfortunately, they will ask their governments to come in to protect their shipping lanes, and we will see a militarization of the Arctic that will become one of the biggest issues of the 2020s.
Well, I appreciate you focusing on those kinds of issues as well. I know it can be a little dispiriting. I appreciate all of you for listening here to the end. Support independent bookstores, support independent media. We appreciate all of your support here at Bad Faith Podcast. A reminder, you can get double the episodes you normally get by subscribing at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month. You get a Monday episode in addition to your regular beloved Thursday episode. And I promise that some of those episodes in the coming weeks are going to offer a little bit of levity to break up the doom and gloom and things go boom of the world right now. So thank you as always. And please do try to keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.